All right, guys, this is Miss Brito again. We are in part 2 of chapter 26 in Amsco. So this is the second lecture video for time period 8. And now we're still in Truman's presidency, but we're looking more at foreign policy in this lecture. So we're looking at the origins of the Cold War. So I'm sure you know about it from Global, but just to kind of recap, the Cold War is centered on the rivalry between the two superpowers of the post-World War II era, the US and the USSR, and their ideologies. So the US is going to be all about democracy and like the Western style and capitalism, and the USSR is all about communism. And this is really going to dominate foreign policy in the US from the late 1940s to 1991 when the USSR collapsed. Also when Miss Brito was born. So, great way to remember that. And today's focus, the focus of this video, is what started the Cold War? Was Truman's response to Soviet actions reasonable, or did he overreact to Soviet attempts to secure their borders? And was Truman too soft on communism? So basically kind of evaluating his policy on the Cold War. So to really understand this, we have to go back to before 1945 and remember that the U.S. has kind of always viewed the Soviet Union as sketchy and as a threat to all capitalist countries ever since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, when they turned into a communist country. So the U.S. response to this, we saw this after World War I with the Red Scare. Remember Sacco and Vanzetti getting killed, charged with crimes and then killed. And the U.S., we actually refused to recognize the USSR as a country until 1933. FDR only recognizes them as a country so we can start trading with them and trying to get out of the Great Depression. And then really nobody trusts the Soviet Union after Stalin made that pact with Hitler, that non-aggression pact where they split up Poland. So everyone's looking at them like, you're very shady, sketchy people, and we do not trust you. Now, of course, after Hitler betrayed Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union, the US and the Soviet Union established this alliance, but it's more of, the enemy of my enemy is my friend type thing of them we actually get along. So Stalin, who was right here, get my little laser pen. So Stalin, who is right here, he is very upset because one half of all the deaths in World War II were from Soviets. Soviets lost really the most people in terms of sheer numbers. And so Stalin is complaining that the US and Great Britain are hesitating to invade Europe. Right? They're taking too long to do D-Day and whatnot. And basically at Yalta then, which is one of the conferences where the big three came together, big three being we have Churchill over here, FDR, and Stalin. They have these tensions, they're negotiating over the post-war plans for Central and Eastern Europe. And basically what we see is that they all agree, though, we are going to have the United Nations. So think back to the League of Nations and all of those goals that Wilson was trying to get. Now, though, the U.S. is going to be on board, and we're going to have the United Nations replacing the League of Nations. And it kind of seems well for a bit. Everyone's like, okay, well, we have these two superpowers, kind of rivals. They're now like coming together to work on this team to prevent any more fighting. But even within the UN, there's going to be now a rivalry between the Soviets and the US. And the UN has multiple parts. So it has the General Assembly, which every single state, every single country has automatic membership. And then you have the 15-member Security Council. That's a little like higher up. They maintain international security and they authorize intervention. So they authorize when the UN should send troops in if someone's done something bad, like Hitler invading Poland. So the permanent members of the Security Council are the US, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China. They all have permanent spots, and then there's a rotating group of other people that get to come through. And everyone's Security Council, they can kind of veto other people, and veto say, no, I don't agree with this plan to go intervene in this country. So we're going to see the Soviets and the US trying to block each other's goals on the Security Council. All right, the Soviets, though, they reject the Baruch Plan for regulating nuclear energy and eliminating atomic weapons, and this makes America question Soviet commitment to peace. They also declined to join the World Bank, which is set up to kind of help countries rebuild after the destruction of World War II because they viewed it as capitalist. And the US, again, feels like, why are you not engaging in these global endeavors with us? The Soviets did join the US and other allies in the Nuremberg trials, which tried the Axis powers for war crimes and human rights violations, specifically trying the Nazi leaders, which we kind of, you guys had that homework to read about it. So hopefully you did that. And really, a lot of the distrust towards the Soviets is going to come in 1946 and 1948 because the Soviets had occupied this land as they were going towards Germany to invade them and defeat Hitler, but they stayed here after the war. And Stalin, he held elections like he promised to at Yalta, but he manipulated the elections. So while elections were held, they were not truly free elections. And really, everybody who gets elected is a communist who is loyal to Moscow, loyal to the Soviet government. So we call these puppet governments. So puppet governments are forming in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, pretty much anywhere in between Germany and the Soviet Union. And Stalin and the Soviets, they wanted a buffer state or a satellite state, which are basically countries under control of a great power. They wanted this as protection against another Western invasion. They were really afraid of getting invaded again and losing more people. And so they feel like they have to basically control these countries and create a buffer between the allies and themselves. And the US and Great Britain are very critical of this. They see this as a violation of self-determination, especially for Poland, which is the country whose invasion kind of set off World War II officially. So, what the Allies had decided to do with Germany once it was conquered. So Germany and Austria, they're divided into zones under a specific Allied power. So Great Britain gets a zone, France gets a zone, the US gets a zone, and the Soviets get a zone. The capital of Germany, if you look here, look where it is. It is deep into the Soviet section. And within Berlin, each power gets a section of Berlin too. So you're going to have the British section, the French section, the American section, and the Soviet section, but it's deep inside there. So really, Berlin's kind of the Allies part of Berlin, the Great Britain, US part, they kind of depend on the Soviets to kind of help them out because it's deep within the Soviet territory. Now, the Soviets, they want a weak Germany for security reasons. They don't trust Germany, and they want war reparations for all the damage done. But Great Britain and the US, they blocked reparations for the other zones, for these zones, because they saw the economic recovery of Germany vital for the stability of Europe. They saw what happened after World War I with that Treaty of Versailles, with Germany having these massive debts, not being able to meet them, all the poverty going there, leading to these extremist, fascist people coming into power, and they do not want that. So the other allies, Great Britain and the US specifically, are going to kind of see stability, economic stability, as a way to stabilize politically Europe. Now, Churchill, he gives a speech in Missouri, which is actually where Truman's from, with Truman present, and he declares an iron curtain has descended across the continent of Europe. This is a metaphor. This is not a real curtain. All right. And this is a metaphor for basically separating the Western states from the Soviet satellite states of Eastern Europe. And you now have this iron curtain here. You can see it's like clamped down on people who are trying to escape. And basically, Western democracies, they don't like this. And they're calling for, with this iron curtain speech, is really calling for Western democracies to halt the expansion of communism, which we are going to know as containment. We want to contain communism where it is. Do not let it move another inch. So, Truman is losing patience with the Soviets, especially after there was a Canadian spy ring which was stealing atomic secrets for the Soviets, and the Soviet Union wouldn't get out of Iran. All right, and so if you look over at this cartoon here, I want you to note that during this time period, a lot of cartoons will portray the Soviet Union as a bear. Okay, so if you see a bear, it's going to represent the Soviet Union. And so Truman, he adopts that containment policy I was just talking about. Keep Soviet influence where it is. Do not let it spread. All right, and you can see here the bear is hungry and he wants to go expand in all these areas. So we cannot let him do this. This is created by a couple of bureaucrats and generals, but really we associate it with George Kennan here. And it's motivated by the failure of appeasement. So if you remember appeasement with the Munich conference, we looked at those Dr. Seuss cartoons where they told Hitler, yeah, you can take over Sudetenland if you don't take over anything else. And they took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. And then he invaded Poland. So we don't want to give in to the big, bad, scary guy. We want to show a tough, strong force. And this becomes the dominant US policy for decades, really for the majority of the Cold War. So you must know containment policy. Keep communism contained. It's in its name. You should be able to get it. Now, the first use of containment is going to be known as the Truman Doctrine. So basically, we have communist-led uprisings in Greece. All right. And the Soviet Union is demanding control of a water route in Turkey. So we don't like this. We don't want any Soviet influence in any place it's not already at. And we definitely don't want any countries turning to communism. So what Truman does is, as soon as the Truman Doctrine, he asks Congress for $400 million in economic and military aid to assist the, quote, free people of Greece and Turkey. So we're sending out our dollars. We're trying to, again, stabilize these areas because we believe if they're economically stable, they will not turn to communism. They'll stay more capitalist, more democratic countries. And then that kind of whole thing basically is going to morph into the Marshall Plan. So after World War II, remember, Europe is in ruins. They have no food, they're in debt. There's a really, really brutal winter that just like makes everything worse. And so you start to see these communist factions forming in France and Italy. In the US, we do not want this. So what is created is the Marshall Plan. It's formerly known as the European Recovery Program. It's actually a name for General George Marshall, who creates the ideas. And we are going to give $12 billion over 4 years, starting in 1948, to revive the economies of Europe. Because again, we believe if we strengthen their economies, people are happy when the economy is doing well, and that will stabilize their politics, stabilize their democracies. People will have no interest in communism if the economy is doing well. That is the thought. So this is offered to the Soviet satellite states as well, not just to Western Europe, but of course they don't accept it because they're under Moscow's control. So it works wonderfully in the countries that do get it. So the Western European countries like France, like Italy, they're like, they're building themselves back up after the war, where Eastern Europe is kind of staying behind. And we actually still see that today in terms of poverty levels. Western Europe is a lot wealthier than Eastern Europe today. And we're really creating this rift then between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, not only in terms of ideology, but in terms of economics. Now, Stalin, he really wants complete control over Berlin. Remember, Berlin is in the Soviet section of post-war Germany, but it's split up and it's still run by Great Britain and France and the US. So he wants to drive the other allies out of Berlin. So he does a blockade, blocks all land access to Berlin, and he's just hoping that the other allies will just give up and let him have full control of the capital. But Truman refuses. He doesn't want to use force, though, because he doesn't want to start another war. We just had the worst war ever, so we don't want that again. So he is not going to use actual force to open up the roads. And he's not going to give up West Berlin because he doesn't want to seem weak. So instead, he orders the U.S. to fly airplanes over West Berlin where they are going to drop supplies. So they get down really low. You can see children here waiting, and they drop boxes of food and other supplies. And this is known as the Berlin Airlift. Now, just in case Stalin retaliates, Truman sends 60 bombers to bases in England, but Stalin does not retaliate with the military, and in May of 1949, he finally ends the blockade. The result of this, though, is that we get now the formal creation of two Germanys. So we have West Germany, or the Federal Republic of Germany, which is backed by the U.S., in East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic, which is backed by the Soviets and really a Soviet satellite. So kind of think about how like North and South Korea exist today. It's like that, although now Germany has reunited. Other things we start to see with the beginning of the Cold War are the growth of mutual defense pacts. So we kind of talked about this during World War I when we have like the secret alliances, and if one of your alliance members gets attacked, you have to back them up. Same kind of thing here. So the first one's NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Everybody on this map in yellow is part of it. So it's the US, Canada, and 10 Western European countries. They're going to mutually defend each other against outside attacks. Now, this is really notable because you guys know Washington's farewell address. What did he say? Okay, good. Remember, he said, do not get involved in Europe, do not get involved in permanent alliances. And here we are doing both of those things. Eisenhower, who led D-Day, famous general of World War II, and future president, he is selected as NATO's supreme commander. And we station troops in Western Europe just in case there's a Soviet invasion. We're trying to, warn them and scare them a little bit. You cannot pass, right? You cannot pass here. Containment, stay away. And Stalin responds with the Warsaw Pact, which is basically the same thing, and that is going to be the satellite countries that you see here that Moscow is kind of already controlling with their puppet governments, and the USSR. So we have these two big mutual defense alliances facing each other. Other things, we really are going to ramp up our defense system. So we passed the National Security Act in 1947. This modernizes the military. First, we're getting rid of the War Department. We're replacing it with the Department of Defense to coordinate all the armed forces together. We're going to create the National Security Council, which is going to coordinate Cold War foreign policy, and we create the CIA, aka the spies, and all of that. Now they have their own little agency. It was actually quite a big agency, and they're doing all their covert intelligence all around the world. And then, of course, one big part of the military is weapons, the arms race. We're going to see a large arms race between the US and the Soviets. The Soviets, they were testing their own bomb at the same time we were testing our bomb in World War II, and they successfully detonate their first bomb in 1949. In response, Truman approves the hydrogen bomb, known as the H-bomb, which was tested in 1952, and it is 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. And the really big thing that's going to really set off this arms race is the National Security Council, this new group. They released a report called the NSC-68. They released it in 1950, and it recommends that the defense spending, it goes up to 20% of the country's gross national product, which is basically all of the goods and services we make, all of our kind of, income for a year as a whole country. 20% of that, 20% should be dedicated to defense. And it also says we need to form alliances with non-communist countries around the world. We need to make them pro-US as opposed to pro-Soviet, pro-communist. And we need to convince the US public that this costly arms buildup is necessary. So let's evaluate the US policy so far. So sort of the critics, they say NATO and this arms buildup is actually intensifying Soviets' fears. Now the Soviet feels like we're an aggressor, we're a threat, so they're going to respond accordingly. And we're starting this unnecessary arms race, which could lead to, nuclear bombs going off everywhere and just chaos and world destruction. Supporters point out that NATO is actually one of the most successful alliances in history, and that there was no nuclear weapon used since. No one's used a nuclear weapon on another actual country since we have in World War II. So maybe it's actually a successful deterrent to weapons being used. It checked the Soviets. They never could go too far, and NATO still exists today. Now let's move over to Asia. So containment is not successful in Asia. While it is successful in Europe, it's not going past the Iron Curtain, is not successful in Asia. So many Asian countries are now gaining independence. They were either owned by France or Great Britain or Japan or whatever, and now they're getting independence, and they don't trust any Western influence, especially, anyone coming over and trying to help them, they're like, you colonized us, you imperialized us, we do not trust you. So that includes the US. And so Japan actually, ironically, ends up being the closest to the US in Asia, our closest ally for a long time. And you can see in this cartoon here, we have Uncle Sam. He's coming through in the waters, and it's the red iceberg. And of course, you see this. This is the symbol then of the Soviet Union. Look at these gravestones, these countries they've already killed and taken down with them: Poland, Hungary, China, Czechoslovakia, North Korea, East Germany. So they've all fallen then to communism. Containment has not worked with them. So let's talk about Japan first. Japan is solely under U.S. control after World War II. General Douglas MacArthur, who kind of was the main general for the Pacific Theater, he's in charge of Reconstruction in Japan. We are going to put 7 Japanese generals on trial and execute them for war crimes. We do allow the emperor to stay as a ceremonial head of state, but we're going to have a new democracy formed with their new constitution. And the Constitution also renounces war as a tool of national policy, really limits the military, says it can really only exist for defense purposes. And really now Japan depends on the US for their defense. And we still today have a lot of military in Japan, specifically here in Okinawa. You can see this is the US today and all of these military bases we have here. So this is a result of the US-Japanese security treaties. Japan surrenders its claims to Korea, to islands in the Pacific, and the US ends formal occupation of Japan, but we keep all of these bases there to protect against external threats and communists. Now, China had a civil war going on before Japanese kind of came in and invaded and did all that stuff. And now that it's over, that civil war is starting again. So during World War II, we had given money to Kai-shek, the leader of the Nationalist Party, to prevent Japan from taking all of China over. After World War II, though, Kai-shek is now fighting in a civil war against the Chinese communists led by Mao. All right, the communists are much more organized, and they appeal to poor, landless peasants and to those who question the nationalists because of the corruption they had within their ranks. To the U.S., we sent George Marshall to try to negotiate an end to the Civil War. That failed, actually, and the nationalists go on a retreat in 1947. Truman, he seems unsure what to do. He rules out an American invasion. He doesn't want us to get involved, doesn't want us to send troops on the ground, but we do send $400 million in aid to the nationalists. And again, because of their poor planning and corruption, a lot of this military aid actually ended up with the communists. So by 1949, mainland China, all of this in yellow here, is controlled by the communists. And the nationalists have gone and they've fled to Taiwan right here. And they're still claiming to control all of China. So we're still, the US, we're still maintaining support of the nationalists. We refused to recognize mainland China, communist China, until 1979. We actually pretended that this little part here controlled all of this until eventually it became kind of, you couldn't really pretend that anymore. It was too obvious. So the Sino-Soviet Pact in 1950, so Sino always means Chinese, that intensified fears of a worldwide communist conspiracy because now we're really freaking out. We're like, oh gosh, all these communist powers are coming together. And Republicans, they blame Democrats and Truman for the loss of China. They say Truman failed here. He wasn't tough enough. Our next Asian foray will be the Korean War. So after the defeat of Japan, Korea is divided along the 38th parallel. The Allied victors basically are going to split it up again, just like they did with Germany. So the Soviets are in the north, the US is in the south. This is supposed to be temporary. They're supposed to hold elections. And in 1949, the US and the Soviets, they leave with the north in control of the communist leader Kim Il-sung, and the South is under a conservative nationalist Rhee. But things don't go to plan because June 25th, 1950, North Korea shocks the world by invading South Korea. And Truman called for a special session of that UN Security Council. They authorized UN forces to intervene, and they put U.S. General MacArthur in charge. So this is not really an official war. It's considered a police action, and it's backed by the whole UN. So this is not the U.S. going in on its own, but the US is the main player in terms of military. But we do have UN approval to be there. And you can see here what's happening. So the US and UN forces, they struggle at first, all right, but the MacArthur, he's able to invade and push back the North Koreans, but he does not stop at the parallel, all right? He keeps going, and he gets really, really, really close to China, and China doesn't like that. China doesn't want to be invaded. So then Communist China sends over their forces, and that pushes back the UN and US forces farther past the 38th parallel. And eventually, after all this brutal fighting, there's lots of atrocities on both sides, it's terrible, they just end up stabilizing it, reestablishing that 38th parallel as the division, which is still there today. But MacArthur, while doing this, he really angers Truman because he starts publicly saying that we need to expand the war, we need to bomb China and invade China, like use an atomic bomb again. And Truman doesn't like this. He's like, listen, you don't make the plans, like officially, like I'm in charge, I'm the commander-in-chief, you're under me, you don't have the right to publicly criticize me. So Truman recalls MacArthur for insubordination, basically takes him out of duty. And the thing is, though, he was really popular. He was the hero of World War II. So the public is siding with him, and they're criticizing Truman and saying, why aren't you listening to your general? You're letting communism destroy Asia. You're weak. All right? So containment did stop communism from spreading into South Korea, which Truman is then trying to use as justification for expanding the military and sending troops to overseas bases. But again, Republicans are seeing Truman and the Democrats as weak. All right, and then lastly, communism in the US. So just like after World War I, we have a Red Scare after World War II. And this, again, is going to all be going on with this idea that the communists are everywhere. They're trying to invade. And in the US, many Americans believe communist spies had infiltrated the government and military. We have the Loyalty Review Board, an investigation of 3 million federal employees, basically looking for communists everywhere. And thousands of people are going to resign or lose their jobs, many who have nothing to do with communism. We also have the Smith Act of 1940, said it's illegal to advocate or teach the overthrow of the government by force or belong to any organization with this objective. So basically, you cannot join Communist Party. And then the McCarran Internal Security Act. This is passed over Truman's veto, kind of along the same things. You cannot advocate for the support or establishment of totalitarian governments. This restricts the travel of communist organizations and even authorizes the creation of camps for people who are communists. And you can see the propaganda from this era. All right, so America under communism, look, all the communists are killing the good American people. The flag is up in flames. Is this tomorrow? Don't trust the commies. And then other things we see, the Un-American Activities Committee. This actually starts kind of at the start of World War II to seek out Nazis. But then after World War II, it's really seeking out the communists. And we start investigating government officials as well as the Boy Scouts. Are there communists trying to, infiltrate our youth groups and turn the youth against us? What about Hollywood? Is Hollywood sending us messages in the films that are trying to turn us into communists? So this leads to the blacklisting of many Hollywood officials and the restriction of freedom of expression for many artists. And so loyalty oaths are now required by writers, by teachers as a condition of employment, and you can get fired if you are seen as not being loyal. Now, there are actual cases of communist spies in Great Britain, Canada, and the US. So in the US, we have the Hiss case. So Alger Hiss, he's an official in the State Department. He went to Yalta, all right, and he is convicted of perjury, of lying to the court and sent to prison in 1950. He's convicted on evidence from a confessed communist, and basically the kind of main person putting him on trial is Richard Nixon, who's now going to become famous, kind of get a spot in the national headlines, and he will actually become president soon. And this makes Americans wonder, though, who else is a communist spy? So we're going to have the Rosenberg case. The FBI accuses Julius and Ethel Rosenberg of espionage and aiding the Soviets. They're convicted and executed after a controversial trial. This should sound familiar. It should sound like Sacco and Vanzetti from the 1920s. So the Rosenbergs, they're arrested after basically a worker on the Manhattan Project on the atomic bomb admitted to giving the Soviets secrets. And all of this leads to what is known as McCarthyism. So in a speech in 1950, this guy right here, Senator Joseph McCarthy, argues that there are 205 communists working for the State Department still after Albert Hiss. And this fear, I mean, he just made this number up. Like, look at him. Does he look like someone who's telling you the truth? No, do not trust him. This allows him, though, to become one of the most powerful men in America. He just has this list. He's just putting names on it. And if you accuse him of kind of lying, he'll put you on the list and you'll lose your job. He had all these unsupported accusations. He's trying to discredit Truman's administration, and he's very popular among the working class. Eventually, his downfall comes when he accuses the army of being communists, and he is interrogating them and bullying them on live TV. And this is upsetting to people because they're like, yo, like they just like fought a war for us. Like, what are you doing? So McCarthy loses support and is censured, meaning he cannot speak anymore in Congress. Fun fact, if you've read The Crucible, you know, it's set in like the colonial days, but it's actually about McCarthyism, where they're all just accusing everybody of being a witch and they have no proof. Yeah, that's McCarthy. All right. So that will be the end of lecture 2 for time period 8, Amsco chapter 26. Have a good one, guys.